Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to come down to the spiritual capital of North America. I thought it was my town, but you are giving us, yes. So it's a pleasure to be here. Can we start with the video?
Sure.
I thought we should just, my brother-in-law made a short promo video for the book. It's still a rough cut, but I think you'll enjoy watching it. I'd like to read from the opening pages of the book. It's from the preface, and it's titled, the preface, and it's titled, Your Hinduism. You are an achievement. You may not fully know why just yet, but you have probably felt in some quiet way the fact that you belong to something significant that has come before you in history. You might not always know how to express that feeling, but you know that it inspires you and it elevates you. You belong to the one civilization that still stands much as it once did, even after all these thousands of years of human history. Thousands of years of wars, conquest, pillage, subjugation, desecration, and devastation. Thousands of years of supposed progress that have given us a world today that runs on brutal violence against nature, life, and the planet itself. You belong to a civilization that is still standing, but surrounded, as it were, by a mess, in India and across the whole world, of environmental devastation, cultural confusion, ethical indifference, and economic insecurity. But still, it stands, still there is hope. For a civilization is not just buildings and machines, but its people, their thought, and their culture. It is a way of knowing the world, a way of giving meaning and value to the contents of life. It is a resource, most of all, for living intelligently. It is a form of culture, an expression of sensibility, a way of harmonizing science, philosophy, and ethics in a people's every thought, word, and deed. You can call it a religion, a way of life, or a civilization. You can call it what you will, but no word will suffice. 1 billion people on this earth still call God by the same names that people did thousands of years ago. What exists on this earth unchanged for that long? What religion exists on this earth for that long? When so many people have distorted religion and dragged it down from being about love and freedom to being about hatred, coercion, and war. Hinduism could have been wiped out a long time ago, but it wasn't. You are here. So I believe, as the title of the book's the caption here says, we are living through a very important historical moment. This is a moment of civilizational awakening. It's not fundamentalism or fascism, as my field tried to convince me it was. My many years of education, my many years of reading New York Times and The Guardian and all these papers, it's not. There is an element of roughness, which to an extent, to a large extent, I think is understandable given how frustrated we are as a community and as a nation, as a civilization. But I don't think the ignorant can have us where they want us anymore. Okay? I think what we're witnessing right now is truly significant. Now, what does it mean to be living through a moment like this? What does it mean to essentially wake up and say, this is who we are? You know, we're going to tell the story, that the story that has been told about us by all these other groups of people who could barely fathom who we are, what our thought is, what our culture is. What does it mean for us to now start speaking, to tell the story ourselves? And at the outset, you know, I have to say, it has been challenging. It has been very, very challenging, you know, writing about Hinduism accurately and sympathetically as I have for the last several years, being in a field that is institutionally and almost deliberately, it seems, you know, determined to misrepresent us. So what I think, but it's very, very gratifying to me that, you know, there are fora like this, that we are all talking about it, and you know, we are feeling a part of this moment. Now, just to give us a bit of historical perspective, you know, I was trying to think of what it means to actually change the narrative. I know a lot of writers, a lot of activists in the community are talking about it the last several years. I think the important thing is what we're doing right now is no different from, or what we are feeling now is no different from what probably Charles Darwin felt, you know, in the 1850s or whenever, or Galileo felt. Excuse me, or I don't know, maybe Abraham Lincoln felt that too when he had to make an argument to his peers that slaves were human beings too. Or our own Mahatma Gandhi. You know, when he came back from South Africa, he found a nation, a people who were so quiet in many ways, and obviously there were many other leaders too, but essentially he had to speak to the people and give them a new self-understanding, which helped them remember, you know, that they were children of immortality, that they were not these weak, passive creatures the British propaganda had told them they were. So what we're doing right now, what we're doing in our classes and forums like this with our own children, and when we have these conversations, is reminding them who they really are. And, you know, the temples, the culture, all that is one part of it, but ultimately I think we need to start looking at the kind of massive social, cultural, and of course financial investment that also has to be made in just simply gaining what everybody else has, which is the right to our own narrative, our own representation about who we are. So just a couple of quick thoughts, and before I talk a little bit about my background, my field, and then the book itself, because yeah, I'm very excited that I've come into this issue from the perspective of media studies, and I'm not a trained theologian, but it appears that there is a need for a lot of media work, given movies like Slumdog Millionaire and all the stuff. So I think that, you know, two main things that are required obviously in terms of changing the narrative. One is the infrastructural investment, you know, the institutional investment, you know, creating gatherings, creating organizations which can make sure that, you know, knowledge about our philosophy, our tradition, and our way of seeing the world is preserved, refined, brought up to date, and then passed on to future generations, you know, engaging with universities, engaging with the media, and I'll talk more about how to do that later. But in addition to the infrastructure, there's obviously the more subtle aspect, which is the ideas, right? So we can't simply throw money at the world. I know many of us are very good at engineering, science, and business, but you know, reworking stories and you know, aesthetic and intellectual experiences is something which is more subtle, which we can do, but we need a little more, I think, training and reflection to do that. So changing the story obviously also requires an engagement with ideas, and I'll talk about some of these you know, today. You know, for example, very quickly, you know, I was as as I was saying a little while ago. One of the big challenges outside, I'll say, is we've been put on the back foot because when we debate the way we are misrepresented, we usually get into the debate and in terms of this Hindu-Muslim or Hindu-Christian kind of identity terms competition. And it's understandable given that you have all the different groups of people saying things about us in academia and media, but that is no longer working. So I feel that the way we can really start taking control of the narrative is by calling out those who don't understand us on their own terms. So we don't have to say a certain scholar is hostile to us because she is Jewish or she is Western, whatever, and it doesn't matter what personal intentions are, for private conversation. But in terms of public engagement, media and academia, we have to say, you are professionally wrong. Okay, you made your argument professionally, you say this is what Hinduism is, and these are the reasons why I think you're wrong, 1, 2, 3. So getting it more universal, dignified, professional, I think that is one thing, and I'll talk more about that. So these are the two main things in terms of changing the narrative, but then there's one more thing I just wanted to share right at the outset with the community, just so we recognize how important the challenge ahead of us is, that we can't take anything for granted. Our prosperity as a community, our label as a model minority, all of these have served us well to a certain extent, but the fact that we are still facing this painful situation where we can't change the textbooks in California and the nonsense they write about us. I mean, all of this is really, really wrong, and it has to change, and it will change, I know. So one thing I ask that the community think about, just to know how serious this is. Now remember in the old days, in many families in India, there were many children, some of the sons would go and join the king's army to defend the country, and one or two would stay home to look after the parents, right? And I know it still happens. So my request, suggestion for the community now is, if you have 2 or 3 children, let 1 or 2 of them go and become doctors and engineers, that's fine. Let at least one child of yours go into academia, journalism, media. Okay? So that is the only way things are going to change. We need to get our brains and our hearts into the cultural fields as well, because otherwise we're always going to end up seeming like amateurs. So I'm not discounting the importance of science and engineering. That's what has created our base as a community. But if you have a child who's not following the line, you can tell them that you met a guy who dropped out of engineering and didn't make good. So tell them my success story, so to speak. All right, so let me actually, to fit into what to tell your children in case any of them want to go into media studies, I want to tell you a little bit about what my field is about and how it got shaped and how sort of I came into the study of Hinduism through my field. So in media studies, we not only teach media making, practicing making movies and all that stuff, and some of my colleagues do that. We also teach a lot of classes on analyzing the media. Okay, so the idea basically is, it's only by studying media narratives, by studying how the media influence society, the history of the media, and how media are connected to other important social issues like globalization, media violence, war, terrorism, all these things. It's only by studying the media academically that the next generation of media practitioners can also tell a better story. Now, the field itself was not exactly the way it is now, and I'm telling you this because the way the intellectual history of media and cultural studies played out is very relevant to understanding a lot of the wrong stuff that is being written about Hinduism today, particularly by Doniger. She's not a media person, but her arguments come out of a certain intellectual tradition, which I'd like to share with the community. So, we know exactly where our opponent is coming from intellectually, and we can demolish him or her or his arguments, accordingly. So my own story in terms of how I came into media, very simply, I grew up in Hyderabad in the 80s, and my parents sent me off to study engineering, which after 2 years I realized I was very bad at, and they were nice enough to let me quit without making me feel too bad. They made me feel quite bad, but not too bad. Then I went to Delhi to study journalism, and then I took an interest in media studies because I realized there was a field which was looking at the world around me and giving me the language to observe how it was changing, how culture was changing. Now this was 91, 92, and you remember what happened in India in 91. Star TV came and fell on our heads. So all these changes taking place, and so that's how I got interested in the field. So once I joined, the field, I got my PhD. Then I started teaching and so on. So I want to give you a quick map of what the media studies field looks like. Now initially, the field of media studies actually used to be called mass communication research. And you may remember in India too, a lot of people used to say mass comm research, and so that's what the field was called. So the field began in the early 20th century, around the 1920s, and not surprising because most media, began around the same time, at cinema, radio, television a little later. So 1920s, 30s, mass communication research got institutionalized. The approach in the early 20th century was very, very normative and functionalistic. And what that basically meant was the people who were doing media research really stopped to ask big questions about whether the media were telling the story correctly or what everything meant. They were simply looking at the media as a tool to sell stuff, for one thing, but more importantly, as a tool in battle. So remember, it was an interwar period, World War I, World War II. A lot of the media research actually was first funded by the US military because they were interested in this phenomenon of propaganda and counter-propaganda. So they wanted to know exactly how to design these posters or pamphlets that they would drop from the plane to demoralize the enemy, and conversely, protect the American population from being brainwashed. So that's how the field started. Until the 50s or 60s, it was a very staid field. It never asked any tough questions. It was it was done mostly by people trained in psychology and psychological paradigms. So it was very good at microscopic research, behavioral research, looking at what happened in a lab setting. It was not very good at asking big questions about how the culture was changing, for example. Now, the international wing of communication studies, and I mention this because in a way it's also connected to the present crisis in Hindu misrepresentation, was known as development communication. So if you study journalism or mass comm in India, say in the 70s or 80s or even early 90s, chances are that all your knowledge was coming from the development paradigm. Now development is obviously a nice sounding word. It means progress, good things for everybody. But it also had a lot of ideological and cultural baggage, because development communication, very simply, was based on the premise that the third world, quote unquote, which is what India was, I guess, from 50s to 80s, or more recently, was underdeveloped, not because we had been plundered by several centuries of colonialism, but we were underdeveloped or undeveloped basically because of our culture. I'm simplifying it, but that was the general argument of the development paradigm. And so you had all these scholars who had to study radio and television to figure out how to create pro-development messages. Now on the good side, the development school is what gave us Doordarshan and All India Radio, and in Telugu it was called Palu Chelu, and I think in Hindi it was Krishi Darshan. You remember those shows? So it was all from that school of thought, about using media to educate people, which to a large extent was good, but then it also had this cultural baggage where religion and culture were somehow assumed to be the reason why we were backward, So that was a development paradigm. So that was a field to the 60s. Now 60s and 70s, obviously huge social and intellectual and cultural upheavals took place all around the world, particularly on campuses like UC Berkeley, the free speech movement, anti-war movement, and black power, civil rights, everything. Now, all of these had a very interesting effect on academia. Initially, and I would say mostly, it was good. Because what all the stuff did on campuses was to challenge the old dominant paradigm. whatever the old scholars in sociology or history or international communication was saying about the third world or about blacks or minorities or women, people were now speaking up and saying, no, that's wrong. That is your point of view. It's just an ethnocentric point of view. So in many ways, it was a very, very effective and important intervention. And I think that's when words like intervention started being used. And in my field, the big change that took place was in the emergence of a school of thought called British Cultural Studies. Just curious, have any of you heard this phrase? Okay. So British Cultural Studies began in the University of Birmingham in the 60s. It's associated with a group of scholars, most notably Stuart Hall, who was a sociologist by training, but he was from the Caribbean, Raymond Williams and 3 or 4 other scholars who were pretty much all Marxists. And what they tried to do was to bring in a critical Marxist analysis of culture and economy and society, basically raise questions about politics and power, with usually good intentions, in the name of poor people, minorities, immigrants from the post-colonial world, and also study culture and media more qualitatively. Okay? So, 2 things happened with cultural studies. One was, it started to approach the media really in terms of meaning making. So scholars started to look at how the media tells stories. Semiotics was a very important approach which helped them. And by the 70s or 80s, cultural studies, not the 70s, I would say by the 80s or 90s, cultural studies spread worldwide. So today, virtually every academic department in social sciences and humanities in many parts of the world, I would say particularly the 2 courses in America, most liberal schools tend to be cultural studies influenced. So that's why my field no longer is called mass comm research, it's called media studies. So now the good thing is cultural studies really made media studies interesting. That is a good part. And it also lent a voice to many communities which previously didn't have a voice. The problem, of course, is that today you may have Islamic cultural studies, Buddhist cultural studies, black cultural studies, gay and lesbian cultural studies, all the stuff. But we are yet to see a cultural studies that reflects the viewpoint of 1 billion people, us. There's no Hindu cultural studies as such. And, the reason for that, I'm not quite sure yet. But all I know is that, the time for change has come. Just a quick example, in terms of this huge absence. So in the 60s and by the 70s, you had all the different communities setting up their own departments, right? So you had ethnic studies and black studies and Islamic studies and Judaic studies. Theoretically, that was the time we also should have got a voice. We should have got a seat at the table. I don't know why it didn't happen, but it never happened. And then by the 80s and 90s, the opposite started to happen. So by the time I entered the field in the 90s, the whole field of cultural studies, which I totally agreed with on a lot of fronts, for example, its concern for poverty, for human rights, all these things, which were, I could really sympathize with that, was surprisingly the total opposite when it came to Hinduism. Right? When it came to our field, whatever studies that were being done on Indian media or Hinduism in the media, did not look at us as essentially post-colonial subjects, as people who had been misrepresented, colonized for several centuries, and who are now also trying to speak for ourselves like any other community. Instead, we got branded as the villains, the oppressors, the hegemons. And hopefully now you're starting to see where Wendy Doniger and a lot of Martha Nussbaum and a lot of these new scholars are coming from. So with a very, very generous heart, I'll say their intentions are probably in the right place. But then their actions, their work has been so skewed that, they've caused us a lot of pain. And they've caused the spirit of truth a lot of pain. And, let's help them. Let's tell them how they can correct their story. Okay? So, so the quick example I wanted to mention was that, a few weeks ago there was the unfortunate terrible incident actually in Alabama, where a gentleman, Suresh Bhai Patel, was brutalized. And around the same time there was another unfortunate attack in North Carolina. And it was very interesting to see and compare the media discourses around these 2 events. Okay? So we had Al Jazeera TV on their website published this huge article on 30 years of research on Islamophobia and misrepresentation of Arabs in the US media. And it's all, solid research. It's been well done and it's published, it's there for them. And something like this happens in Alabama, then again in Seattle, all these things are happening, and we don't even get, the narrow margin to say, hey, we got some concerns here too. Because the media, lashes out and they come down on us like a ton of bricks and say, oh no, if poor Suresh Bhai was brutalized, it's not because of Hindu phobia, there's no such thing. It's because the Hindu community is not anti-racist enough. I suppose you read that, right? That was the position of the progressive activists about what happened in Alabama and Seattle. And what does it mean, you're not anti-racist enough? It's a way of saying, oh, you Hindus are racist. Okay? Just so you know why all these things, I'm connecting the dots like this, and I'm going to get into this big fat book, but only briefly. That is Wendy Doniger's The Alternative History. The first half of the book, basically Doniger makes some very outrageous claims, not the parts about sex and stuff that's, I think largely unimpressive to me. She makes this point that the Aryan invasion of India, the coming of Hindus to India, as she puts it, was comparable, or at least she compares it, to the Nazis going on Anschluss, or annexation, across Europe in World War II. And the European conquest, settlement / genocide of the Native Americans. Twice, page 111, 144, if I'm not mistaken. So, this is a person who was being feted, celebrated by all the world's press as, this remarkable voice of liberal Hinduism was being criticized by Hindu fundamentalists. I'm not a fundamentalist. In fact, I don't even know what a Hindu fundamentalist would be, considering we don't have any fundamentalist organization, to issue diktats. So here we are, where, a supposedly reputed leading scholar on Hinduism makes these weird claims that, we are comparable to Nazi Germany. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is a weird thing that happened in the 70s with the emergence of cultural studies and postmodernism and all these new trends, where on the one hand, they challenged the old Eurocentrism, ethnocentrism, they gave voice to many communities. But in a very weird way, they decided that now we are the bad guys for things we didn't do. If there are any bad things members of a community may have done, sure, let's address it, we'll reform. We've always been reforming, that's how we've survived. But we are now considered to be the bad guys, to put it very, very simplistic, in this calculation of identity politics. So that is the problem in academia today, in humanities and social sciences. Everything seems to play out in terms of identity politics. Okay? So you can have a scholar who speaks as a feminist. You can have a scholar who speaks as an Islamist. But do you have a scholar who can speak as a Hindu? Probably not, right? I mean, the moment you say Hindu, oh, you're Hindutva, you're oppressing minorities and, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, so I have tried very hard and I have tried to be very patient and to, start pointing out to my own field, because I'm sure there's a lot of good people who have good intentions, but they need to know better, to tell them that this is the way to do things. It's not cliches. Let's not throw cliches at each other. Okay, so that is kind of the field, and then I got interested in writing about this from the late 90s. There was this controversy about MTV and Aerosmith, which put a picture of Lord Krishna on the cover. So there were all these weird things going on about Hinduism in the media, and here I was getting my PhD and then teaching about Hinduism, teaching about the media, and I would never be able to locate any kind of work being done on the misrepresentation of Hinduism in the field. It just wasn't there in the field. Now, there were a lot of scholars working on Hinduism in the media, but for them, it was always about Hindutva. MTV came to India, it led to Hindutva. Ramayana came to India, Ramayana was made on TV, it led to Hindutva. So I said, this is very unimaginative. What about studies which look at what Hinduism means? And I tried to do a little research on mythological cinema, the golden films of NTR and my mother and the good old days. And I realized the field was not mentally equipped to handle studies which, looked at how Hindus view media and popular culture. So in a way, I'm very lucky because Hinduism is such a democratic, free and popular religion. Because, by being in the field which studies popular culture for a living, in many ways I think I've been able to appreciate the beauty and the relevance of Hinduism in the popular realm rather than in the scholarly, Indo-logical realm, which is where a lot of the battles are taking place right now. Okay, so my first issue on which I got really upset, I would say, was the California textbook issues in 2006, and at that point, I was not very actively connected, but when I read what these textbooks were saying and what the academics were saying, I felt the need to write about it. And since then, I've been, observing things, and there were some very, very absurd examples, and I talk about many of them in my book. Now, finally, the book itself, I wrote in about 3 or 4 weeks last April, and it was really it came out like a torrent of pain and hope, and it obviously reflects the culmination of I think many years of thinking and writing about these issues, but it's also a very unique book for me in the sense that the first half of the book is sort of a critique of Hinduphobia in the media and in academia. And again, by Hinduphobia, I don't mean it in a psychological sense, in the sense of individual attitudes, I don't know. I'm just talking about a systematic bias, that distorts not only, representation of Hinduism, but other things too. Actually, let me quickly read you my working definition of this. Hinduphobia is not a quirk or an individual stereotype that afflicts some individuals. It is a systematic distortion in human thought that serves to distract the world from the cruelty and the needlessness of suffering. Not just Hindu, but all human and non-human suffering too. It exists not so much in the indifferent mind of the average world citizen today, but in the upper echelons of the institutions that define the world and its people today, the media and the academy. So that is the first part of the book. It is polemical, but I think it is very, very reasonably argued, and I hope you read it to get a sense of how nasty the climate has become about Hinduism, because it's no longer, we're still, when we call out these people for their Hinduphobia, we're still fighting an old battle. We are fighting it with sticks and stones, so to speak, to put it that way. Because right now, see, 100 years ago, the language was openly racist and interreligious, interracial, right? It was like, as one religion saying, we are superior, you guys are backward, things like that. Today, it's not like that. Everybody's speaking the language of universalism and human rights and, secularism and all these things. But what they have done is created their own fantasy about what being liberal and secular means. Okay? And anything that slightly deviates from their fantasy is fundamentalism, it's fascism. Okay? And unfortunately, for them or for the state of ignorance in the world, I think when our community puts its minds to it, I was very inspired by the brochures I read about the initiatives that are being done here. We built these great temples, right? Now why can't we change the discourse too? Right? So, the second part of the book is, the first part of the book is called Desakala Dosha, which is my way of saying these are the distortions in the discourse on Hinduism today. The second part of the book is called Sanatana, a Hindu view of God. It's much more poetic, devotional. It's just my take on what I understand from what little I've understood from the Vedas and the gurus and teachers, Upanishads, the Gita, the Shavataar, and so on. And it sort of gives it a contemporary tone. But to give you a context to why I kind of wrote it in this way, very simply, as a human being, I think, or maybe it was my guru's influence or my dad's influence, whatever it is, or my wife's, whatever it is, I think in the last several years I've just learn to recognize pain and suffering when it exists in the world. Just learn to understand the pain of other human beings, other living beings, which I think is a great human quality, which we don't teach enough of these days, because the media is teaching our children the total opposite, right? Especially the TV shows today, the reality shows where people are eating cockroaches. I mean, for what? Or people are going and jumping onto walls and breaking their hands and heads and taking up hospital rooms. You know, I mean, all crazy things are happening in the culture because of media around the world. So anyway, so when I see pain happening, I mean, I don't know, I think I've reached a point where I can totally see it and it hurts me, it pains me, and I feel it shouldn't be there. Now, my training as a social scientist, and for this I do thank the field of cultural studies and whatever I've learned, my education, has taught me that much of the pain and suffering that exists in the world today is unnecessary. Okay? It is entirely the result of a totally blind, destructive, all-consuming culture. Call it modernity, globalization, colonialism, whatever you will. But essentially one cloud, one storm of ignorance has been going around the world for about several centuries now. And the way I conclude in my book essentially is that it collided with India and it sort of cooled down a little bit, so they got, look at it this way. They had the Dark Ages, right? And then they discover India, and then they have the Enlightenment. How come none of us have ever connected that thing? And then they talk about how the Enlightenment came about only because of Greece and Christianity, and now they've been trying to civilize the whole world and teach us how to be better, all that stuff. So anyway, so my understanding essentially is that much of the pain and suffering that exists in the world, whether it's war or terrorism or environmental devastation or even teenagers doing silly things and banging their heads on the wall, all of these things shouldn't be happening. There's no need for hurt and suffering in the world. And for that, to change that, we need to change the culture and story. Now, cultural studies gave me some intellectual tools to recognize these problems, but then cultural studies has also had its problems, and the biggest problem is it never engaged with Hinduism or dharmic sensibilities. The best I've been able to do in my field is to read Gandhi seriously and Gandhian thought seriously, especially Hind Swaraj. I taught a class on Gandhi in the media last year, which students really enjoyed. So what I hope will happen more is that the social sciences, the liberal arts, and not just Hinduism studies, right, but every field, media studies, history, literature, all the fields start dialoguing with Hinduism, with the way we think about the world, whatever resources we start, reviving. And I think it's there, the knowledge is there in our community, in our elders, in our villages, in our ashrams, but a lot of it has not found its way into English. It's found its way into the mainstream world. Okay? So that is the challenge. I just go for another 5 minutes and then we'll probably take questions. So I want to give a very quick overview of the first half of the book. So in terms of my critique, I'm just curious, how many of you followed the Doniger controversy last year, or you heard about it? Can you raise your hands? Okay, so I'll just tell you quickly what it was about. So there is the world's greatest expert, so to speak, on Hinduism is a professor called Wendy Doniger. Very senior scholar, Sanskritist, linguist, I think, by training. So she wrote a book 3-4 years ago called The Hindus and Alternative History. Last year, the book came into the news because in February or March, the publisher, who's also published my previous books in India, Penguin, very good publisher, decided to withdraw the book from the market because there was a legal challenge against the book filed by an activist, an education activist in India, and the publisher decided that they would just withdraw the book and pulp it. Now in reality, I think the book sold out, not a single copy was pulped, nothing happened. But then it turned into an international outcry where people said, oh yeah, Modi's winning and already there's censorship in India and freedom of speech and all this stuff. So at that point, some of us who had read the book or knew her work, felt that there was something really crazy going on with the discourse around the book. Okay, The way, for example, even Professor Doniger was presenting herself in the op-ed she wrote in the New York Times, she says, there is a law in India which makes it a crime to hurt the feelings of Hindus. There's no such law, right?
Say it again.
Yeah, she wrote in an op-ed, I think it was the op-ed called Banned in Bangalore, the one she wrote in New York Times. And she says, I'm the victim of a law in India, I'm paraphrasing, I'm the victim of a law in India which makes it a crime or an offense to offend the feelings of Hindus.
Absolutely wrong.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's wrong.
It is totally wrong.
Yeah, that is what the New York Times, the quote-unquote paper of record, said. By the way, quick solution, whenever anybody comes and says the New York Times said this or the Guardian said that, just tell them, they also told us they were WMDs in Iraq.
Right.
And how many hundreds of thousands of people have died because of that, right? So they're not above the law, they're just prestige. And unless they change, a time is going to come and they're going to be seriously irrelevant, And I mean, I'm writing these articles, I'm doing this as much for Hindu Dharma as for the better values of liberalism. And if these guys, don't shape up, I think, seriously, it's we Hindus have to teach them what genuine liberalism is again. Anyway, so and then the USA Today published an article by Stephen Prothero, supposed to be an eclectic scholar of religions, where he described Wendy Doniger as, like this oppressed but beautiful soul of liberal Hinduism, who Sojourner Truth. I said, you're comparing somebody who has enjoyed the privilege of a very, very privileged pulpit, and to somebody who's, suffering from slavery. Anyway, so there was all this discourse going on, and so obviously I went through the book very, very carefully again at that point, and I wanted to kind of present a clear, accurate understanding of where she's coming from, where this idea of an alternative history is coming from, and then what is wrong with it. Because what happened is a lot of the community's criticism of Doniger, I think, focused on issues like her obsession with, sexual themes and this and that, and we didn't really have the tools intellectually to understand where she's coming from and to point it out, which I've done in my book, hopefully. But very briefly, this is kind of how it's laid out, where it comes from. I have a chapter called The Myth of an Alternative History. That is one of the Desakala doshas. I should get a puja done for it. Well, my book is my puja. So, I don't know if you remember, when many of you probably came to the US in the 70s or a long time ago. The story that was taught about the history of America was that America was discovered by Columbus, and then there were these savages living here, and Columbus came, and so on and so forth. Now, again, because of cultural studies and all these changes in the academia, by the 80s and 90s, that started to change. And for the better. There's a very popular book called Lies My History Teacher Told Me, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So there are all these important books which said, look, you need to look at American history from the point of view of the Native Americans, the blacks, the women, all the other groups, which is great. And now everybody else is trying to do that. Now, you can probably see the connection. So in a sense, Doniger is trying to say she's doing the same thing, right? The Hindus an alternative history. And so that is the problem, because what has happened is everybody sees this book and thinks that, oh, this is the history of the lower castes and the women and the animals and all the subalterns who were oppressed and blah blah blah. If if that was really the case, I would have been celebrating that book. It wasn't. So the best way to look at it is very simply this. When you were in school in India, how many of you remember when you read Indian history? I know it's a long time ago, I hope you remember. Did you read that the Indus Valley civilization was Hindu or not Hindu? Do you remember? Can you raise your hands? Not Hindu.
Not Hindu.
Right? Yeah. I think 60s, 70s, 1980s to the present. And your children's California textbooks? Not Hindu again, right? Now, Wendy Doniger's book? Not Hindu again. Okay. Now, the Vedas, to us, sacred sounds, you just hear those words, you feel blessed. Okay, it's just in the beauty of the sound itself. Adoration for the divine. The Gayatri mantra, we're not, and I talk about that in my book, We are not saying, take me to heaven or, bring death to my enemies or give me a good rabbit in the hunt or whatever. No, what are we saying? Make me intelligent. Oh, light, let me see your light. That's all. I mean, let me not have any illusions about your beauty, your divinity, your truth. Or later Mahatma Gandhi, Sabko Sanmati, equal-mindedness. So all I understand about Hinduism, frankly, is it's not about dogma. It is about just keeping your mind and heart clean and straight so you understand reality. It's about intelligence. So anyway, so the myth of an alternative history now creates this idea that there is some hegemonic dominant Hindutva history which, the alternative history is now fighting. And it's very simple. When you go to Barnes and Noble, look at the Hinduism shelf or Eastern religion shelf as it's usually called. After all the Buddhism and all, you'll probably find one or two books by Gandhi, maybe something by Eknath Easwaran, which is nice. Yogananda, of course, local salutations. And you will find Bendy Doniger's books. Right? You will not find any of the people that you may find in a bookshop in India, the Hinduism scholars. So what is passed off for an alternative history is actually the dominant hegemonic history, both in its content as well as its positioning. It's worldwide. I mean, the other day, my interview in Swarajya magazine, there was a nice exchange in the commentary, and somebody went into a bookshop in Singapore, and apparently the only Hinduism book there was Doniger's. Okay. Now this name, in media studies, there's a very useful phenomenon called cultural imperialism. And it describes, something we all know, when a movie is made in Hollywood, it is screened all over the world, right? But when even a huge movie is made in India, it barely gets beyond the ethnic markets in the US. Okay? Now it's very simple, we can argue about taste and all that, but the simple truth is that this is a post-colonial reality. All our nations were created as markets for England and the West, and that continues. So media scholars call it cultural imperialism. Now there is cultural imperialism in academia too. So when a scholar of Hinduism in the University of Chicago or wherever writes a book about Hinduism, even if it's called Alternatives, Oppressed, Subaltern, Marginal History, it is going to get star play, in North America, in India, all over the world. So that is the real, dominant paradigm in every possible sense. Now, as for the real alternative history, the real people's history of Hinduism, it still has to be done. Maybe in one generation we'll get it done when your non-engineering child gets into the field. And hopefully it's my hope my book will raise a lot of the questions that we need to start asking. So the next few chapters in part one, the myth of the Aryan invasion, I don't get into details about what exactly this was about, but I take issue with the storytelling itself. I mean, what is this whole thing about some people who came thousands of years ago and they invaded and they brought us Hinduism? Just the other day there was a reviewer writing about how Hindus came to India, Hindus conquered India, Muslims conquered India, Christians conquered India, let's all get along. I mean, this is just strange, and let's all get along. That part I agree with. Let's all get along today, I'm fine. But I mean, how can you equate a religion, a spirituality that's so deeply caught up in the place? Sure, we may have, absorbed influences from here and there, made it our own, that's what we're good at doing because that's how broad-minded we are. But to kind of, equate essentially imperial projects, imperial conquests with a group of people who may or may not have come, chanting Vedas, I don't know. So very, very funny stuff about Aryans. Anyway, I didn't even want to go there, but I just had talked about it. Now the next chapter, which is my pet chapter, so I'll just take a minute to talk about it, is called the myth of Vedic violence. Just out of curiosity, when you listen to the Purusha Suktam, do you ever think of somebody being chopped up or cut to pieces? No, right? I mean, neither did I. I remember hearing the Purusha Suktam being chanted in an ashram where thousands of people were crammed on the floor of different nationalities, different castes, different classes, and I understood the meaning of those words to mean what modern democracy is telling us to believe, that all these hands, all these heads, all these bodies are all part of the one divine being, right? Now, I'm not an expert in ancient Sanskrit the way some of these professors are. I just teach media studies. But I find it amazing that the scholarly view on Vipurusha Suktam is supposed to mean that, somebody, it's all about cutting up pieces, cutting up a man into pieces. So I talk quite a bit about Wendy Doniger's treatment of violence in Hinduism. She makes some preposterous claims, by the way. I think the most preposterous one is, she says, when she talks towards the end of the book, when she talks about 1947 and partition, she describes the violence that followed in India as Vedic in nature. Okay, so it was Vedic violence after partition. So, you're talking about this total fantasy that is, going on, being passed off as this heroic, alternative view around the world. So I think what the community now needs to start doing is start getting into the act, start contesting these things on the terms on which they're made. Alternative, it's not an alternative. We are the people. We are the real alternative. You say that our Hinduism is an invention, it was only invented in 1890s by the British and Brahmins. Okay, in that case, why are you saying that the only thing about Hinduism is caste system for 5,000 years? Which one is it? Make up your mind. So there are all these contradictions. Let's call them out on those. And let's just forget about the inter-community naming, because we're not going to win that one. That is their trick. That is where they want us. Just forget about it. Call them out on their illogical claims. And the biggest thing, and it's a very complicated thing. My argument in the chapter on violence, very briefly, my argument is this. I actually go in, because my interest is in narratives, media narratives, popular culture narratives, and so on. I was looking at the patterns and why there is such an invested interest in these scholars in saying that Hinduism was very violent until Buddhism reformed it, and then the Mughals came and reformed it further, and then the British came and reformed it further. So there is a timeline, there is a civilizing timeline that they're trying to fit our history into. So, for example, very quickly, the names of the chapters in Doniger's book. There's a chapter called Sacrifice in the Vedas and Violence in the Mahabharata. And then we also have chapters called Dialogue and Tolerance under the Mughals. So, read between the lines, look at the narrative, what is being, expressed over here. Okay, so in this, dominant, Hindu-phobic, hegemonic historiography is just how we talking about how we tell history. It's very simple. So the argument basically is, we were very violent, and Buddhism tried to civilize us, then the Mughals tried to civilize us, then the British tried it, then they got frustrated and they left, and then what happened? Then, from the 1950s to the 90s, the dominant India story in the Western press was, will India survive? And now since the 90s it is, will India turn Hindu fascist? So there is, you can see that whole story very clearly, and I'll tell you where that story is coming from, a lot of it, and that's why in the beginning I said Hinduphobia is not just about misrepresenting Hindus and Hinduism, it is about misrepresenting the worldview, the civilizational worldview which we have developed over thousands of years. It's still there within us. I hear traces of it, when our elders speak, when our kids speak, and sometimes when Modi ji speaks, his Teachers' Day speech, some of his speeches last year were, very, very, very perceptive in that sense. So it is that worldview that we now need to start bringing into academia, getting it coherent and all well organized. So my critique of, this whole violence thing, okay, one more story I have to share. Tell me a movie or something you think about when you hear the word monsoon. You think of a movie song?
Monsoon Bedi?
Not monsoon, just rains. When you think of rains in India, one or two nice songs, can anyone? Thank you. Lagan, yes. Yeah, what is it called? Oh, the rain song. Yeah, beautiful. You know that song. When you think of rains in India, you think of, water coming, people are smiling and laughing and playing, earth is returning to life. It's the most beautiful feeling, right? I'm right in that. Okay?
Fragrance.
Sorry?
Fragrance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Mitti, the red. Or even the Colonial Cousins had a beautiful song, right? You know that in the 90s, Indian Rain. Nostalgia now. Now, according to Professor Doniger in this violence chapter, Hinduism has violent and whimsical gods because of the monsoons, violence and uncertainty. I kid you not, that's what she wrote in the book. So, what I'm saying is there is such an obsession with violence and it's so off-key. I mean, is that how we think about monsoon as violence? No. So she's wrong about the monsoon, she's wrong about our gods. Simple as that. So in this chapter I get into a lot of stuff. By the way, if your kids have dinosaurs or books about dinosaurs and evolution, I talk about evolutionary history, the way prehistory is told, because all these are connected. We have to connect the dots because we are probably one of the oldest or the oldest civilization on earth. Because the dominant history in the world today is, okay, so long ago, prehistory, very quickly, there are dinosaurs, with big teeth, all the time killing each other, survival of the fittest. Evolution, then monkeys, then hunter-gatherers killing each other. Then finally civilization comes in, West Asia, Greece, font of civilization, and then Europe takes the civilization, gives it to all of us. That is the dominant story. Now our story is, okay, wait a minute there. We know our civilization has been there for a very, very long time, and because for a civilization is not just buildings, it's about being cultured, it's about samskriti, samskara, being nice to each other, not causing pain to each other. And now how do we connect the dots between prehistory and history? So a lot of it has to do with, I think, the mythology about violence in Western social thought. And so I talk a little bit, and again, I've read quite a bit about, critiques of social Darwinism and so on and so forth, and that's kind of where it comes from. Part two of the book, again, is just the spiritual part of it. Now just to conclude, so obviously I think my hope in this book is that we can start moving towards a Hindu view of life, nature and history. Now the challenge is, what is a Hindu view? Considering how diverse we are, how free we are, and how universal we are. Now that is the challenge for us intellectually, and I think it's a great thing, because a few months ago, Philip Goldberg had a nice piece in Huffington Post where I think finally he expressed a dilemma we have, where we've been the original nice guys. I mean, it's okay, people can criticize me if they want to, but I believe that. Because we've been very, very universal. It doesn't occur to us to fight people over names of God that is so trivial. Right? It never occurred to us, philosophically. So you had all these other cultures, for whatever reason, I speculate on some of them in my book. It's about the weather, but anyway, just speculation. Come in now and tell us, all these crazy things about us. So the challenge now is, how do we start claiming this identity as Hindus? Because everybody is speaking the language of identity today, right? In academia and multicultural society. So we have to embrace being Hindu. I don't think there's anything wrong or remotely, reason to be apologetic about it. Let's be proud of it. Now the question is, but how do we do it in a way that stays true to our sensibilities, which are very universal, right? I mean, we want to restore Hinduism not just because we want to feel better, because we want to kind of speak to the world and say, hey, look, we've been around for a long time. We see things you guys are still barely learning to see. The Titanic is about to hit the iceberg, which is what my Marxist professors always used to say, but I think I can say the same thing. We can see things going wrong in the world. So, just to conclude, I want to read probably my favorite lines from the book, just 2 minutes, and then open up for questions. We've gone a little longer, I think, but so part 2 of the book, Sanatana, is just about sort of my spiritual view of Hinduism. This is from a chapter called Cousins and Friends, which is really about Krishna, Rama, the Puranas, and how I see it. Hinduism is rooted in one glorious instruction, which is to see all as one. Tvameva. Right? Tvameva Matam. It is an instruction ideally pursued in certain idyllic environmental conditions. In the forest, perhaps, the deer park, perhaps, in the morning sun-bathed face of a Himalayan peak. There the sense of you alone is clear. There the salt and water dissolve peacefully, like in the Upanishadic example. There you are alone, a sage withdrawn from world and worldly mind. There you can be one and become one, with the capital O. But what of the rest of us? What of all of us living not in forests, not in serene Himalayan lake hermitages, but in this world of noise, anger, competition, desires, demands, and most of all people who will not be what we hope they will be. We are put in a social world, in a family, in a job, in a school, in a community. We are not just spirits in search of truth, but we are sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, cousins and friends, colleagues and co-workers, races and nations even. We are in this world. We are here as sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers, cousins, friends. Krishna and Yasoda, Rama and Kaushalya, Sumitra, even Kaikeyi, Parvati and Ganesha, Krishna and Arjuna, Rama and Hanuman. Between them unfolds the universe. Between them unfolds all the love in the universe. Ideally, we remember, Tvameva Mata Pita Bandhu Saka. But we, humans, we carry more than the moment with us. We carry history. We carry thought. We carry, to use a contemporary word, baggage. Sometimes, in between two humans, a boy and a girl in love perhaps, or a mother and a baby in play, or an elder and a grandchild, what lies between them blooms full and true into the moment. It is love. It is true. It is the sustenance of the cosmos. Baggage is forgotten. But more often than not, in the daily grind of our lives, what lies between humans is not love. It is perhaps only habit, a social role, an itch, expectations, sometimes a prison. Sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers, cousins, friends. Between them, sometimes, also burns all the folly of hate in the universe. Eviscerating hate, body-eating hate, Hiranyakasipu hate, Kamsa hate, Kaurava hate, kingdom-scorching hate. In this jungle of our tangled lives and lives, in this wilderness of affection and attachment turned into recrimination and wound, in this samsara, amidst shards of words and actions, flying like pieces of broken glass, we do not see love anymore. Still, it is from within this bitter brawl of family life that we Hindus yearn to find our gods, our Shiva Parvati, first family, Vishnu Lakshmi, and our beloved avatars, Krishna and Rama. So, my belief essentially is that, there's all these debates going on about whether this is mythology or history, what really happened. I think the significance of our God stories essentially is that they are connecting our lives today in the micro-social and with much bigger questions. And the challenge now is, how do we take these stories, which have given us the ethical templates for our lives, and turn it into a broader civilizational vision that is universal, environmentally friendly. We are the original environmentally friendly people, and take it from there. And leave on an intriguing note. So the last chapter, by the way, is called Jagat Guru. So on that note, I'll